When it comes to the vast, vast world of gaming, I feel that for every genre that exists, there are games that people insist you play. For platformers, it's usually games like Mario Galaxy or Mega Man X. For horror titles, it's usually Resident Evil 2 or Silent Hill. Visual novels, games like Phoenix Wright or Fate Stay Night. And for JRPGs, the one I hear the most about are Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. Very popular titles that pretty much everyone recommends and sees them as the pinnacle of the genre. But when it comes to that genre, there's also a third game that people bring up, and that is Xenogears, a game originally pitched as the script for Final Fantasy VII, but rejected it for being way too dark. However, the devs at Square did see potential in the idea and had it made into its own game, which would then later become the beginning of the Xeno series. Although, you probably know them more nowadays for the Xenoblade titles on the Nintendo Switch. And a while back, I had decided to run a poll to see what series we should review next on the channel, considering we had finally wrapped up all of Trails, with Xeno winning by a very large margin. So to kick things off, here's my review of Xenogears. Kick back, relax, charge your gears, prepare for some deep questions about yourself, and let's get into it. So to kick off my list of long praises, let's talk about the graphics, because this game looks absolutely stunning. So I'm pretty sure that every gamer knows this, but the PS1 era was when 3D gaming started to become much more of a mainstay. A lot of franchises wanted to utilize it to really push graphics in games to the next level. However, there were some games on the system that didn't do that, and instead decided to see how far they could push pixel art graphics to a brand new level with this stronger hardware. Games like Star Ocean and Mega Man X4 specifically come to mind, where they mix together traditional 2D with the newly evolved 3D. And Xenogears was one of the games at the forefront of this evolved form of pixel art games. So many aspects of this game are just genuinely amazing to look at. From the gorgeous looking forest and sand areas that you traverse, the beautiful looking character models that traverse the world itself, but the absolute best looking part of the game is easily the models in combat. I love how fluid and just downright badass they look moving around whenever they do attacks, especially when you watch the special moves known as death blows. Whoever programmed these into the game deserves a raise and every bit of praise until the end of fucking time. I actually can't really think of a moment in this game where I was playing through it and thought to myself, yeah, that looked kind of bad. Everything just aged perfectly here. The game was also one of, I believe, the first of its kind to incorporate animated cutscenes as well. And honestly, they still look great to this day. Most 90s era anime honestly does. I wonder what the trick was. Probably Elder Magic. I'm gonna guess Elder Magic. The only other thing that I think has aged even better was its gameplay. So let's wrap up talking about the graphics and get into talking about that. Now, since this was a Square Enix title during the 90s, you can probably guess the kind of gameplay it had. If you, for some reason, couldn't, it was real-time combat with a focus on 3 party members. And before booting it up, I knew nothing about what this game did differently, so I just kind of assumed it was be more like Final Fantasy, but with a few minor add-ons. Holy shit, I was wrong, and I was so glad I was, because this might be one of the most unique combat systems I've ever encountered in a game. So, Xenogears combat is much less like a traditional RPG, and more like a hybrid between a JRPG and a fighting game. Instead of a traditional way of JRPGs where you choose things like attack, defend, magic, item, you instead are given a set amount of actions that start off at 3 and increase the more levels you obtain. And each of the 3 actions you can take use up a set amount. Triangle attacks take up 1, square strikes take up 2, and X attacks take up 3. So battles become this game of pick and choose to mix and match for the best use of your action points. Do you sacrifice as many points as possible to do as many hits as possible with only triangle? Do you mix and match triangle and square? Do you just use only the X button to deal damage? It's all down to how well you can combo these skills together and use your points as effectively as possible. But then there's also option D, the death blow system. And that's where the fighting game aspect of this comes in. As you progress throughout the story, you unlock special techniques known as death blows that can be utilized through certain button combinations. And it's up to you, yes, you, Nimbus, to utilize them in the best way you can. 2 triangles and then X, square, square, X, triangle, square, X. How well can you utilize them is down to you and you alone. And these death blows do a good amount of damage, but come with the downside of completely ending a combo once you use them. But why would you want to end a combo early? After all, if you ended it early, don't you lose out on hitting the enemy more? And we all like hitting things, like I did to your mom. Well, in truth, there's actually 2 benefits to doing so. For one, death bows, like I said earlier, do a lot of damage, so these can be useful in defeating bosses. And 2, for every bit of leftover AP you have, it'll go to a gauge beneath your health bar that lets you utilize your secret weapon known as the multi-death blow strike. And once you have enough points, you can spend them all to do death blows over and over again to deal truckloads of damage into an enemy and drain their health. Of course, it's best utilized when you fight bosses in the late game to absolutely decimate them. So far, this combat sounds awesome, right? Sounds pretty dang amazing. Well, what if I were to tell you this is only the first half of it? As we haven't even gone over the second half of combat that goes to the gears battles. Several sections of Xenogears will have Faye and his party getting into these giant robots known as gears. And well, while a big portion of the combat in these giant mechas is very similar, things like death blows, choosing one of 3 button prompts, the gears come with some major differences to make them feel different from normal combat. For one is the heavier focus on customization. While you are customizing your characters when you're outside of the gears so they can survive in battles, gears triple the amount of customization they have in comparison. You need to pay attention to how much weight is on the gears. You need to swap out parts so they constantly have more health and fuel. You need to equip onto them special parts that can give them ultimate moves or let them heal, since ether spells do not heal gears. But the main thing you need to focus on more than anything is something I mentioned earlier, and that is the fuel. So unlike normal battles where you're able to just fight willy-nilly, gears battles rely on a fuel source, since you know you're in a giant robot. And pretty much every action you take in battle costs fuel, whether it be through attacking, activating the boost to get turns faster, using death blows. The only thing that doesn't cost fuel is ether skills and charging. But outside of the attack ones, those aren't really super useful in gears battles, and charging basically does jack and shit to get back fuel. The fuel aspect also ties into customization as well, as several of the things you can buy, like healing items and special moves, can cost immense amount of fuel, and fuel can only be upgraded by buying more engines as you go throughout the game. So it becomes imperative to continually check gear shops so you can keep your mech on the up and up, as late game gear battles can start really draining your resources if you're not careful. I really like the gears combat, and if I'm being honest, I actually like it more than normal combat. Yeah, it's slower than the normal combat, and it does have its own set of flaws, but it's such a genuinely unique mix of strategy and resource management that you don't really see in many other titles. Even today, I don't really think there are any I could point to. If you guys can think of any mech RPGs, let me know in the comments down below. And no, Cyrus Bright, Cold Steel does not count, no matter how Riz-tastic Valimar is. Other than that, there's not really much to say in terms of gameplay left. There are a few mini-games you can tackle in the overworld, with one of them being hilariously unbalanced at points, but that's about it. So I think it's time we moved on to the characters in the story. And I think out of everything in this game, I was genuinely the most interested in what the story was going to be like. After all, the whole premise of this game exists because the original script was too dark for what they were trying to do for Final Fantasy VII, and that has a game where you watch a town get blown up and a girl stabbed through the chest. So, I was pretty interested to see if it really was that messed up, or if Square was simply over-exaggerating it. Oh, after playing it, they were not. Xenogears is a very, very heavy story game, with many serious themes discussing the concept of religion, racism, identity, the value of life, topics that are pretty normal to see in certain games today, but back in the 90s, these were insanely revolutionary concepts to have into your story. And well, I won't be talking about all of the plot points, considering I want this to be as spoiler-free as possible, because trust me, this is a game that is at its best if you experience it blind. However, there is one aspect I will be talking about, as it was my favorite part of the story, and that was the reveal of what was inside Faye. Now, I'm going to be going into some massive spoilers here, so if you want to skip that, I implore you to cut to this part here. Last chance. Alright, here we go, spoiler time. So, a good bit of the way into the first disc, one of the main antagonists, known as Groff, calls you the God Killer. It implies that there's something sleeping inside you. Naturally, you assume that it's going to be this giant demon or monster. After all, that's what a lot of RPGs did back in the day, and it would make a lot of sense. However, Xenogears completely subverts your expectations by revealing there isn't a demon or monster inside of you. There isn't a weapon. It's revealed that Faye actually has a split personality, that it was born there through the severe torture he went through as a kid. Okay, so in Disc 2, it's revealed that Faye is a reincarnation of Groff, so his mother, who's controlled by another one of the antagonists, really long story there, takes him to a lab to be experimented on in order to awaken his dormant powers. And Faye, not wanting to keep going through all of that suffering, created an alter ego to suffer in his place while he could hide away. This new personality, known as Ede, now had to go through everything while the original got to hide away and not suffer. As a result, he grew to hate humanity in the original personality, made even worse when his mother died in front of his eyes, and the original version did nothing but blame him for it, putting him on a path of hatred and destruction. It is a genuinely chilling concept that's honestly way ahead of its time for a narrative in a 90s era JRPG. It made sense why the series became such a hit with a fan base and was so narratively gripping for so many people, when you take this kind of risk and it works out this well. However, they also could just love the story for just how good its characters are. You know, Gears cast is absolutely immaculate. I didn't, but now I do, and I'm gonna say right now, there's not a single bad party member in the entire bunch, each dealing with their own interesting struggles and character traits. Faye, the main character, doesn't like fighting as a result of an accident at the start of the game, wiping out his village, but he's constantly forced in the battle to protect those he loves. Ellie, the main love interest of the game, has an indecision on what side she should choose. Then there's Bart, who feels the weight of the crown that's held over his head the longer he's away from the kingdom. Even the antagonists have these questions thrust upon them, with my absolute favorite being Ramses, this guy who basically struggles to understand what his actual worth is, and as long as Faye's in the picture, I can't really go into it without going massive spoilers, but it's one of the most interesting plot points. He just basically doesn't want to prove he's the trash everyone says he is. He's also, unironically, one of the best parts of Disc 2 just because of the absolute fucking psychotic breakdown he has more and more through it. Not spoiling, but he is amazing. Even side characters you meet through the game, like Hammer, have these very interesting endings to their arc. There's just so much to love about this game's story and narrative that it's honestly fighting every part of me not to constantly gush about it over and over, solely because I want to finally get this video out. So how about we move to my last bit of praise then? And that, of course, is for the music. It's just downright fantastic. Composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, someone you've probably heard of if you've played Chrono Trigger, which I haven't, to be honest. But what I have heard is a couple of the soundtracks from Chrono Trigger, and they sounded pretty good. So I was very interested to see what he could bring to the table for this game, and he does not disappoint. Man's got an impressive amount of range here. He's able to mix soundtracks, making them sound both fun and lively, while also getting cold and serious when it needs to be. It's a good mix of chill and intense that makes you really appreciate it. It also makes me want to play Chrono Trigger because I want to see how that whole soundtrack handles. But that's for another day, because on this day, we've wrapped up talking about the pros. So now, let's get in to the cons. So, if you've heard even the slightest bit about Xenogears, or even one of the many articles depicting all of its issues, you would know the game suffers from a lot of missed potential due to its pretty hectic scheduling, along with a few disagreements of how the game should have ended. With not a lot of people being happy with how this one ended, they decided to make a Disc 2, which came with some problems. It was a game that tried to aim for 150% quality and only got about, I'd say, 100% of that. But before I get into those, I want to go over a few issues that I had with the game itself that I don't see talked about as much. Now, since I don't have any issues whatsoever in terms of how the game looks, I'm just going to get into my gameplay problems. For one, this game is way too easy. Pretty much every fight in this game can be beaten without literally ever having to try. You can kind of tell that challenge wasn't a huge thing they were focusing on. While it's not super upsetting that the game is really easy, it did start to make it kind of boring when every single boss is only really challenging because they have some sort of gimmick. The hardest boss fight in the game isn't really even difficult because it's like a tough fight or anything. It's just that you fight it after you fight another boss and you don't get to heal. Makes the difficulty feel more like it's bullshit and very frustratingly designed. Another gameplay complaint goes to the platforming. So Xenogears introduces platforming as part of its gameplay. And on one hand, I do think this is really cool. I can't really think of any other turn-based RPG or just RPG in general back in the day that tried to mix in platforming. Unfortunately, it's hurt by the fact that the camera and overworld controls aren't exactly what one might call, well, good. Every time I try to do the platforming, it always feels like either the button presses are like half a second of delay on them, or just don't work at all. And it just drove me insane whenever I was trying to utilize it in any sort of the sections they had you platform. The worst being the Tower of Babel, as not only does the control feel delayed, the camera is arguably at its worst here, causing many a failure that don't actually feel like it's your fault. It's a cool idea, really cool idea, but it was not executed well. Okay, I think I've stalled and talked about my minor issues long enough. Let's get into what everyone is expecting. Let's get into Disc 2. So if there's one aspect about Xenogears that's been known by many, it's how the game released in a pretty incomplete state. More specifically referring to how its second disc was handled. Now before I get into this part, I want to say that there is one thing I should clear up. A lot of people think that the main reason Disc 2 was released the way it was that Square intervened and tried to rush out the game. When in reality, it seems that Square was actually pretty considerate towards the development of the title. The biggest issues towards Xenogears is, like I stated earlier, that it was just too big for its own good. As the development continued for this game, they just kept adding more and more to the narrative. Something that you can pretty much see the more you play through it, as you can realize how rich with content the first disc is. However, this also cut into a lot of their dev time, to the point Square was even pitching the idea that they just end it with disc 1 and release a sequel later. But Takahashi didn't want to do that, arguing that if they chose to end it this one, fans wouldn't really be happy with the outcome. So they scrounged up whatever they could to make a second disc to create a new ending. But this time, it came at the cost of a lot of quality. Now the second disc isn't bad, not by any means, but it definitely showcased a lot of the before mentioned missed potential this game has. The biggest being its severe lack of presentation. Instead of exploring a vast world and many dungeons, 90% of this entire disc is just told through text boxes while the characters are sitting at a chair. They do look pretty, especially the pendulum swinging back and forth, but they sadly end up hurting a lot of the game's more emotional moments, as you're told them instead of actually really experiencing them. An example is when Ramses attacks a town, and Ellie's the one to defeat him, and while he's having a mental breakdown over it, she reaches out and exposes his greatest weakness. It's a phenomenal scene, but it's severely weakened by the fact that there's no boss fight to accompany it, so it makes the whole scene ring kinda hollow. But that doesn't mean there aren't areas you get to explore, as while this is mostly text boxes, there are dungeons, except they're not great. They're kind of a massive downgrade from the ones in Disc 1. And while I don't really think Xenogears' strongest aspects was its dungeon designs, the second disc is where they're at their weakest, with my absolute least favorite being the final dungeon, as it kind of highlights one of the bigger weaknesses of Disc 2 and its over-reliance on gear-based fights. See, what made Disc 1 so good for me in terms of gameplay was how perfectly it was able to balance gameplay in gears and outside of it. In Disc 2, however, that isn't the case. Pretty much every playable area in Disc 2 is mainly focused on gears, with the single worst offender of this being the final dungeon, where the entire section is played with a gear. Also doesn't help that the dungeon itself isn't very fun. It's overly confusing, and its puzzles are made with annoying backtracking in mind. The final boss is really cool though, especially with its gimmick at the end where you can fight mini-bosses that when defeated make the actual final boss easier because it erases attacks it has. It's a rad mechanic that makes up for a overall annoying final dungeon. Really good stuff, overall kind of a letdown, which honestly I think encapsulates the second disc of Xenogears. There's a lot of really cool stuff here. That's great to see, but you can really tell that they just didn't have the time to fully turn it into the vision they had. A game that paid the price of overambition, similar to the likes of something I've also talked about before, Tales of Arise. Honestly, the production behind this specific game is so fascinating to look up more about that I would love to do a separate video about it one of these days. Until then, though, that wraps up my cons, so let's move on to my final thoughts. Upon my finishing of this review and looking over the game one final time, it made me realize something. This is a game that, for all its intents and purposes, could have been one of the most iconic games of all time. I feel like if it had just gotten the chance, it could have been up there with Chrono Trigger in terms of icons. Unfortunately, it was brought down not by it being a bad or a broken game, but by its own overambition. It makes sense why so many people say this game deserves a remake, so it can hopefully reach the potential it deserved to. And I think that's why my final rating for this game is still a downright exceptional 9 out of 10. With all that said, we have finally reached the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'm sorry this review took so long to get out. I'll try to have the Xenosaga one out faster. In fact, by the time this video releases, I'm pretty certain I'll have the script done. If you want to follow along the rest of my Xeno series journey, alongside any other content I publish, make sure to do me a favor and like and sub down below, hit the bell for some notifications for when videos drops, and leave a comment down below if you want to chat about this game or just in general. That's all, folks. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you next time for more RPG content.